Hello guys, welcome back to today's tutorial. So in the previous tutorial we talked about accessibility. Today we will be talking about forms in HTML, right? And we'll be talking about um how forms, labels, and input work in HTML. We'll also be talking about the different types of buttons and when we should use them. Would have some insights about client-side form validation in HTML forms and show you some examples with some screenshots. And we'll talk about different form states and why they are important. All right, without further ado, let's get into it. All right, so I have different examples of form in a screenshot. Um, so basically, a form is what we use to collect or gather data. um, so let's say you go to an application and you have to sign up. There's a sign up form, so the entire form where or the entire interface where you have to input your name, your first name, second name, email, your country, whatever, that entire interface is a form, right? So it's used to collect user data, user information. Okay. So if you can see my screen, you'd notice the the first form element here has um it has an action. So action is basically the action attributes is basically where your or the URL where the form is going to submit to. Right. So on the next one we have an input tag, right? So input is basically the element where you get to input your your data, right? It's what's used to collect your data. The next thing, okay, the input has a type attribute, right? The type attribute could be of different types. So it's basically the data type that that input is expecting. So when it's plain text, it's just plain text. When you have text, there, it means plain text, your name, anything text. um there are different other types like the email. There's an email type, there's a password type, right? There are different others that we'll get to see in future and use and work with. So the next form element has a label element nested inside, and then an input element. So basically the label element just gives more information about the input, right? Or it basically labels what that input is for. So is the way this one is it has the input tag inside of the label, so it's nested inside of the label, and it's like that's like implicit. What that means is that once it's nested inside the label, HTML already knows that that label is for that input, right? There's another type which is explicit in the next. If you look at the next right here, this guy here, so this is explicit because the input tag is not nested inside the label tag, right? And for it to know that this label tag is associated with this input tag, you're going to need your for attribute. So it's basically saying it's for the input that has the ID of email, right? So for this to be associated, for this label to be associated with this input tag, you need to give the input an ID of the same value the for attribute has, right? So the for attribute value has to match the ID attribute value for the input, right? I'm sure that's clear. And the last one we have is adding a placeholder, right? So placeholders basically right here inside your input tag as an attribute. So the placeholder attribute basically gives users hint of what that input tag expects, right? The data type that that input tag expects. So you can say an example here. So this is an email. So the placeholder says example at email.com. I'm sure that this is something that you must have encountered in forms when you see like the form has like first name, enter first name, enter last name, and then an example of an email, right? So it's a placeholder that does that thing inside the input tag. All right, so let's move on to the next thing. So this is the next thing is the different types of buttons and when we should use them or when you should use them. All right, so basically what differentiate buttons are their attributes, their type values, their type attribute values. All right, so um the first one we have is a regular button. um it's just button, right? So what buttons do, like when you see a button in a website or an application, it basically means action, right? It basically means that that application wants you to take an action, right? So you can think of a button as an action element. Okay, so there are different types of button. There is the submit, there is the recent, and then there's the default. So it's self-explanatory. Submit means you want to submit the form data, right? And then reset means you want to reset the data, right? It's very easy. So let's move on to the next one. What we have is client side validation, client side form validation in HTML forms. And I've got some examples with this screenshot showing on your screen right now. um all right, so you want to think of validation as um sanitizing data, right? You want to think of it as that, um because you don't want to send improper data that the server does not expect to the server. So client side basically means that, let's say let's say before you submit to the server, because you're submitting your you're submitting your form data, or the form data submits to the server, right? So before we get to this, because the servers also have, there's also something known as the server side validation. Before we get to that, the client, it's important for the client side also has its own validation, right? So I'm sure there are some times where you try to submit your form data without imputing, let's say, your first name, and then you see something that prompts like an alert message that tells you that that particular input field is required on that input field, right? So there are certain attributes we could use to validate our HTML form. The first one is required, as you can see here, right? This tells the user that they need to impute that data. They need to impute that data. That data is required. um if you move further down, you're going to see required. And remember, um where I said required, where whenever you have an attribute like this, it means that it's a boolean, right? It's a boolean attribute, right? So once it's there, it means true. It means you want this input field to be required. Okay, another thing I have missed out to mention is the input element is a void element, right? So the input element does not need a closing tag, or it doesn't have a closing tag, right? So if you move further down, you could see some other attributes we could use for client side HTML form validation, like the minimum length. This is like the minimum character that is expected for that field. And then the maximum length, maximum length 64, min length 4, right? So um if you have a character that's less than 4, it's going to give you an error message, right? On that input, it's going to give you an alert error message on that input form. If you have a maximum character as above 64, it's also going to give you an error. So you see how it's very important to validate, so you know that you're sending the right data. Validation doesn't start and end with client side, right? Your server also has to be validated. You also have to add validation in your server, because some people can bypass client validation easily, but now there are certain things that you need to make sure to add as validation in the server side, right? So that's basically it for today's lesson. Thank you for joining. See you in the next one.
Don't forget to like and subscribe.